I bought all the markers
to find out which are the best in every category and which are not worth your money.
I wouldn't be surprised if these end up winning.
Really?
I'm comparing over 90 different brands, totaling 2,872 markers, and I'm putting them through 18 different tests to compare blending, streakiness, color accuracy, and more. And by the end of this video, I hope to be able to share with you which alcohol markers and water-based markers are the best in the world. And some of the results might surprise you.
That's really interesting. I'd never thought of that.
From Copic to Crayola, it's time for the ultimate marker comparison. I've got a lot of testing to do, so I've decided to jump right in and get an initial feel for each of the alcohol markers and see if any stand out right away as really nice to use or really bad to use. There's a huge variety of thickness, saturation, brush firmness, and overall experience between these brands. The best were hard to identify on such small samples, but some of the worst stood out immediately. While I'm working on this, I also want to prepare myself a testing chart like the one I used in my pencil comparison video. I'm going to be using marker blending paper for the alcohol markers and a normal cardstock for the water-based markers to hopefully give both the best chance. I talked about this difference more in my last video where I explored the surprising ways that both alcohol and water-based markers can be used to create amazing art. If you haven't seen it, open up a new window now to enjoy after this.
So these are the new Pantone markers. So these are water-based markers. With the way that you use alcohol markers, that's a big claim for them to say they work like alcohol markers.
I like the brush tip on
These, you like the brush tip on
but I liked that these blend. If you hadn't told me they were alcohol markers, I wouldn't think they were alcohol markers.
Wow.
They feel like Copic. That blends nice.
I mean, that looks like it's blended really well.
Yeah.
It's going to take a lot more than this to separate the good markers from the best, but there are a few instant disappointments here. The first being Simply Oa alcohol markers. The colors don't even seem to be mixed properly, they are mismatched badly with the lids, and they're just not nice to use. Some of the other cheaper alcohol markers weren't off to a good start either, being hard to blend, not assembled properly, or just super noisy. Remind me why I'm doing this again? If you've ever tried to buy a set of markers, you'll have noticed that there are more options than ever before. And even once you've worked out which type of marker you need, there are hundreds of brands, all with different claims and at vastly different prices. So how can we find the answers to which markers are the best for blending, which markers are safe to use in coloring books, which markers are worth the money, and which are cheap rubbish? Whether you're a seasoned artist, a beginner, or even just someone who's been curious about art, finding the right marker shouldn't be the step that gets you stuck. Now, if you're new here, you might not realize just how seriously I take this testing business. I've bought every marker I can find. I've got spreadsheets, I've got tests on tests on tests. I've got fancy Python coding and techie stuff, and I've got coffee. So disappointing that's not actually coffee. And this isn't the first time that I've done something like this. We've already found the best pencils, the best sharpeners, the best white pens, the best coloring apps, and the best paper. The difference this time is that markers aren't cheap. So instead of buying every single marker, I've reached out to some brands who have provided me with their markers to include in this video. They're not sponsors, and I hope they don't get mad when I'm brutally honest about their markers. But I am thankful that they are helping make this video possible. And even with the 90 brands of markers that I've collected for this video, I still haven't come close to buying every single marker in existence. There are just far too many cheap alcohol markers, all made in the same factories, that we can't possibly test them all. So I've collected a range of alcohol markers, water-based markers, and watercolor markers to test. I also bought some paint markers, permanent markers, and other types of markers just to see how these are different from these main categories. And with the 18 different tests that I have planned, this is still a ridiculous amount of information to gather. So I'd better get back into it. Possibly the most important factor in deciding on the best alcohol marker is how well it blends. Alcohol markers are known for their amazing blending ability, which is why it's disappointing when some of these cheaper markers really suck at it. I've tested every marker's blending ability with similar colors and with totally opposite colors, and even on different paper. Blending with opposite colors is something that no marker will do well, but it does help me to see the biggest difference between them. And if you're looking for a blending tutorial, I talked about this more in depth in the video before this one. So it's time for the streaky test. So the point of this test is I want to see which markers will leave streaks if you're trying to color a big area. Now, generally speaking, if you're using better quality paper or if you're coloring faster, this will reduce the streaks. So I want to find out which markers are less streaky regardless of the paper or other variables. So I'm using plain paper and my goal is to try and use the same pressure and the same timing for every brand of marker. So I've got some help. So this is a metronome. Why did it ding? Is it supposed to ding? Musicians use it to help keep steady time with different speed settings depending on how high you adjust the pendulum. Whoops. Slower will show the streaks more, but slower also take a whole lot longer. All right, so we are doing lento speed. Because I'm using cheap paper, they are all streaky. That's not a sign that they will be streaky if you're using them for art. I really just wanted to find a way to actually tell the difference between the markers and see how they kind of rank here. I'd actually say the ones that perform the best is possibly the CaliArt and the Winsor & Newton Pro marker when you're using the brush tip. It almost seems like in most cases so far, I think the brush tips actually did a better job than the chisel tips. I'm also considering the Spectrum Noir is streaky because it's an older marker. Same with the Copic Chow. They're some of the oldest markers that I have out of these. I think the most disappointing result out of this is probably the Artify, and they are a new marker. One thing that's really obvious is that the real brush pens struggled with this test because most of them just really need water or they need a slower pace to work well. Well, the paint pens and the new brush paint pens thrived in this category. The Artist is actually surprisingly good as well. I've gathered the results and given each marker a score from 1 to 5 to help me get closer to finding the best in every category. These markers come with a range of different tips. Some even give you the choice. And the tip you'll use is entirely dependent on the project. Chisel tips are great for straight lines or calligraphy, and I know a lot of artists prefer the chisel when coloring really large areas. For sketches, illustrations, or doodling, you'll want something more like a fine liner or a bullet tip. If you're wanting to blend multiple colors together, the brush tip is your best friend, and my personal favorite for coloring in general. It's what I use the most, especially for alcohol-based markers. So what does a perfect brush tip look like? I've reached out to Jazza to help me answer this question and to discuss some of his own experiences with different markers. You've obviously done a whole lot of marker testing over the years, just in everyday use, but also you actually did a test about 4 years ago where you compared every possible marker. My question is, were there any major surprises for you in that testing?
Yeah, absolutely. Ohuhu really came out of left field for me. I had always been a Copic user. By the point I made that video, I still, for 4 or 5 years, built up most of their collection, which is not a cheap endeavor, and have used them in hundreds of videos. So going into it was already a bit skewed. And I was also skewed against what I perceived as the cheaper markers. There is a sort of the things that cost more do tend to have a higher quality. Cheap markers don't have brushes. That was the main thing I noticed in all my testing, is it was chisel and bullet, because they're, I guess, the easiest to manufacture. But not only was this affordable and it had a brush, the brush tip was as good, if not better, than the Copic. Ohuhu have now more color range than Copic. They now also provide refills, and those two things alone put it right at the same level, and the fact that they're so much cheaper was huge. But what I actually want to show you is a comparison between the brushes, because this actually is one of the main reasons I give Ohuhu the win out of these two. This is a Copic marker, so when I push down with the brush, you'll notice the tip sort of goes up. It sort of ends up going belly down, and you end up losing the tip a little bit. Whereas this is the Ohuhu Honolulu marker. Because of the shape of the marker and where the density lies, it ends up just being a much more controlled pressure.
This is a similar thought process that I was on when I was comparing the different brush markers, and I noticed that some were much softer and more flexible than others. too firm and it doesn't really work like a brush and gets damaged more easily over time, but too soft and it's much harder to control like Jazza described. So I've created a bucket system to help me rank these from extremely soft to extremely firm, with the sweet spot being somewhere in the middle. All of the real brushes ended up in the extremely soft category, but this doesn't necessarily fail them. They just work differently to these other brush tips. There were quite a few markers that fell into the sweet spot, which I did keep fairly broad because preference is a big factor in this ranking. For me, the perfect tip has a balance of being firm enough to control easily, allowing you to get into small areas with the tip, but also soft enough to be flickable. A flickable brush is one of the keys to easier blending, and flickability seems to be based on the brush feel and the amount of ink that comes out. I'm noticing that some brands seem to let out a lot more ink than others, and not just because they are old or new. The Artex are much juicier than the Copic or Pro marker, and again, how juicy you want your marker to be depends a lot on what you're using them for. For the best blending with alcohol markers, too much moisture does make it hard to overlap opposite colors. The dry markers are easy to use with the flick technique because you can create a slight fade between the colors. But for water-based markers, the juicier markers seem to be the easiest to blend. So first I need to figure out how to actually measure the amount of moisture from a marker. I've got all my markers and I've got some watercolor paper that feels like the right choice here, but in case this doesn't showcase it enough, I've also got some paper towel and some very thin tissue. If the question is, do I need to do a quick dot or do I need to do like a 1, 2, 3, up? Oh, it's so variable. This is actually gonna be harder than I thought. I can hold it for longer. The time matters drastically here. But what also matters is how much pressure I'm putting on the marker. And I don't know how to make that fair. Try to do all these like scientific tests without having a way to do a scientific test. I need like a robot assistant that can just hold the markers. The one thing I can confirm is that the tissue paper and the paper towel is much easier to measure than the watercolor paper. How do we make it fair though? Straight down and we do 1, 2, 3. So I think if I hold my markers straight down and just apply full pressure straight off the bat, at the expense of maybe wrecking the markers, for science. And just to remove another variable, I will use the stopwatch on my phone to try and make my 3 seconds actually 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. Whoops, that's 4. Sarah, do 3 seconds. I did 4 on the first one. All right, we're doing 4 seconds now. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I think we have a system that can work here. 1, 2. So I've measured all these results and I'm starting to see more of a difference between the markers advertised as watercolor compared to the markers advertised as water-based. The watercolor markers often spread a little more, which makes sense if they've got extra moisture to help them move around and stay wet. Other than this, it's hard to know if these results are good or bad. It will be interesting to just document this for now and see how these results play into some of the other things I'm testing, like whether more moisture will damage the paper more quickly in my next test. It's pretty hard to color evenly with just one layer of marker, so building up a few layers is a much easier way to get a solid color, but also to make it more vibrant or to layer different colors for more realistic art. I've layered each marker as many times as it could handle, stopping either when it started to really damage the paper or when the new layer of color took more than 2 to 3 seconds to absorb into the paper. It was interesting to see the difference with the water-based markers being the ones that advertise as watercolor versus the ones that are water-based. A lot of the watercolor markers had a lot more moisture and so they didn't handle as many layers on this paper. I'm sure that would be completely different if we tried this same thing on watercolor paper. But given this, I did think it was a little bit disappointing to see some of these brands like the Montmartre and the Caran d'Ache Fibralo and the Faber-Castell Connector Pen that could barely handle any layers, and they kind of are designed to do that. This is why the Connector Pen always ends up putting a hole in the paper when you've got younger kids who don't know how to like color evenly and end up putting 2 or 3 layers in the one spot. and it just goes straight through. And this is thicker paper than most kids' colouring books. Not that this is a video for kids markers, but it is worth mentioning that the Crayola Super Tips did a lot better than the Faber-Castell Connector pen in this category. In fact, the Super Tips were one of the best in this category. I got 9 layers before it started to damage the paper, which is actually better than the adult Crayola range. I think the real surprise for me was the Careen and the Zig Real brushes that are designed as a watercolor brush but actually didn't overload the layers too quickly. The alcohol markers were all pretty similar. Some only laid about 6 before they just built up way too much ink on the page and didn't soak in. Others got 10 layers and could probably handle more. There weren't really any good or bad standouts. In my final scores, I judged the alcohol markers a little more harshly than the water-based markers. The alcohol means they should be able to layer a lot more on any paper, but anything that's water-based is going to struggle if you build up too much liquid unless you're using them on a paper designed to handle water, like a mixed media or a watercolor paper. I actually talked a little more about this in my latest video and showed just how well water-based markers can create art if you use watercolor paper. Since I've already created all these layers, this is the perfect time to compare which markers bleed through to the back of the page. If you're using markers in something double-sided like a coloring book, you'll want to find markers that don't bleed through the back unless you're happy to forfeit the art on the other side. So almost all the alcohol markers just scored a flat 0 on this test. And I mean, I'm not surprised. Alcohol markers bleed through everything, even marker paper. Most of the water-based markers didn't bleed through the page at all, even after 6 or 7 layers. It was mostly the markers advertised as watercolor that bled through because they just had more moisture in the marker. And actually, the new Pantone didn't do so well on this test either. There is also a little bit of a pattern in markers that look like this. These are really popular for coloring books, but they also bled through the page quicker than I would have liked. So maybe just be careful and do some test pages first before you use these kind of markers on your art. Next up, I want to address a problem that I know bothers many people when using markers: the strong smell. I've been thinking about how to measure this accurately, and I've discovered a few options. There's a dynamic olfactometry, chemical analysis, gas chromatography, instrumental odor monitoring, and even something called an electronic nose. All of these options are super confusing and expensive. But another legitimately recognized method is trained noses who can sniff the samples and give them a ranking. Welcome to our sniff test. And I thought that if I was to do this myself, especially after sniffing a few, might not be the best judge of it. So I have got 3 volunteers who are gonna join us. I'm gonna hand you all the same marker and I want you to rate it 1 to 10. 10 being, this is disgusting, I want to close the lid straight away, I want to get it away from me, and 1 being, I can't smell this at all. Let's go. Get the blindfolds on, take the lid off, give it a sniff, and work out what you're going to give it. All right, show us your scores. Vastly different rankings.
A bit of a sweet smell.
It's not like a bad
We're
one.
ranking how strong the smell is.
Are you serious?
I couldn't smell anything.
Wow.
Whoa. Oh my god.
Oh, I'm getting it from here too.
Oh my
Oh, get that lid back on. Oh, 12.
Whoa.
Oh, this one's got
gosh.
body.
Whoa. A 7?
It smell good. Trying to do a polite fan.
3, 2, 1, flip.
This way.
That's
There you
okay.
go. There you go.
I did it again. I didn't say that I wouldn't give you the same markers twice. I wanted to verify the scores. Paul, you have some explaining to do.
After my last effort, I thought I'll go further away. So I did, and it gave me less of a smell.
All right, at least our scores are a little bit closer to each other this time. We're doing this so that the audience doesn't have to.
It's for the people. I'm taking
Hang
this
on.
seriously, even if you guys aren't. Oh, serious?
1, 2, 3, flip.
You matchy?
You guys got it wrong.
The Touch 5 doesn't just smell strong, it smells bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely peg the nose.
Oh, that is, you know what it smells like? Glue.
Oh.
So not recommended.
Oh, wow. Got some zip?
All right, go. That was the Copic.
This is one of my favourites.
Wrong.
I didn't like it.
And
It was gross.
okay.
I have a feeling that this test isn't going to like clear up anything for anyone.
Oh, this is gonna be fun.
good for a paint marker.
Accurate.
Yeah, it was a Posca. What are you trying to do, Natalie? I think everyone's losing it just a little bit. The lid is already on it. Okay, something's not right here. We have a 1 and a 9. So this is clearly a very scientific, fair approach.
Nice because it made you laugh.
Maybe laugh.
So what did we learn here? Despite all the silliness, we were able to rank these markers on their smell using the numbers that our trained noses gave us. The Chartpak and Spectra markers were some of the worst smelling markers we found, even worse than permanent markers. Chartpak was so bad that I wasn't even able to finish the testing page without feeling a little dizzy. Most of the alcohol markers fell into the middle categories, and only a few of the water-based markers were more than a mild smell. And there is a growing theory in our team that the green markers smell the worst, no matter which brand.
It's green, people, it's green.
Except, of course, the silly scents. Describe it.
That it's kind of fruity.
It smells delicious.
Yeah.
I could get used to that.
I've been cramming in some of these next tests to try and get as much information as possible, as soon as possible. I want to compare the different color ranges. I want to see if any brands are better than others when using a colorless blender to create textures. I want to know if there are any brands that don't layer well with colored pencils. And make sure that I'm giving every marker a chance on different types of paper in case I'm missing something. And all of this is adding up to a lot of information with not many clear winners or final answers. There's a lot of data to gather at this point, and I'm starting to lose track of what I've tested and what I've still got to go. It's been easy to find the worst markers, but finding the best is proving to be tricky. At least some of this testing is fun. Like figuring out how these markers react with water in the most unnecessary method possible. It is important to know how your markers will react with water, not because you'll be drawing in the rain, but because often you'll want to add a sealant or a varnish on the top of your work, or you might want to use them for mixed media. A marker running with water isn't good or bad, as long as you know what to expect. If markers are water resistant, you can use them more confidently with your mixed media. If they are water soluble, you can use them to create wonderful watercolor effects. Is this the most accurate way to test this? Probably not, but is this the most fun way to test this? Yes. So alcohol markers should not move at all in water. They are supposed to be completely water resistant, but there are a few that maybe failed this test. The Caliart and the Spectra AD are definitely the worst out of these, but I do also see a tiny bit of color bleeding on the Montemart and both of the Winsor & Newton Pro markers. But overall, the rest did pretty well. The acrylic paint markers didn't move at all, and the permanent markers didn't move, but the fine liners are kind of a mixed bag. They either moved a lot or just not at all. I didn't know if the Faber-Castell Pitt Artist pens are water resistant, but I guess they are. But probably the thing that has surprised me the most with this is looking at all the water-based markers. The new Pantone markers are water-based, but they're not running with water at all. So it's like a mixed ink of some kind. A few of these water-based markers actually separated colors when they ran, but most of them just worked like watercolors as I expected. I do think it's really interesting that the markers advertised as watercolor markers seem to have moved less than just the typical cheap water-based markers. And I'm not sure if that's intentional or if that's accidental or if that just means that there is no official watercolor marker and it's kind of just a marketing term. This surprises me. The fact that these markers, at least these first 4, are all kind of advertised as the same thing, but the Zig has reacted totally different to the rest. These aren't exactly conclusive results, but it's kind of interesting to see. There are so many things that I want to test, and I'm starting to feel the pressure of not having all the answers and not having enough time. Starting to wonder if I've taken this too far. I didn't even do this much with the colored pencil video, and that was hectic. I still want to figure out which brands have the best color ranges. More markers keep arriving at my door. I've got 3 different brands here that all say they are touch markers, but I'm pretty sure only one is real. I've got my old Copics mixed up with my new Copics, and I can't even tell which is which anymore. I think I need another coffee. Where did my Crayola Super Tips go? I've got over 2,000 markers and these tests are taking forever. I'm sure I had more Lyra than just these. Should I have bought more paint markers? Is Chartpak AD the same as Spectra AD? Why is this called yellow green and pastel green? Neither of these are green. Shane, I think I've actually found a marker conspiracy. Let me show you. So that right there is fresh green. Can we talk about the fresh green, Shane? I've been dying to talk with you about the fresh green all day, okay? So let me lay it out for you. I'm using this marker right. It's called fresh green. And this one is called yellow green. And I'm sitting here like, is it yellow or is it green? And then I'm trying to color something green and instead I'm getting this half-baked lemon nonsense that doesn't know what it wants to be. It's fine, it can be both. No, it can't be both. We live in a world with rules, people. And don't even get me started on pastel green. Oh, you thought it was gonna be a nice, soft, lovely pastel pale green, right? Ha, no, this one's like, surprise, I'm actually a mutant shade of yellow. Why not just call it pastel confusion and get it over with? But I keep finding this word, touch, 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 touch. And let me tell you about touch. You want touch twin, touch 5? What is touch Morky? So I look up touch Chenji on Amazon. And what do I find out, Shane? What do I find out? There is no touch Chenji. This brand doesn't even exist, okay? I've got a box full of touch Chenji. Are they in the witness protection program or something? And I swear, one day one of these markers is going to have a color named definitely yellow, but actually green. Mark my words. So that got a little out of hand. And if you want to see my full touch marker conspiracy, I have kept the entire planning in our after show that you can find in the members area here on YouTube. And it might be time to recruit some help. I decided to get the whole team involved in drawing out and recording every single color of these almost 3,000 markers. Why? Because these inaccurate colors do really bother me. This happens with other art supplies too, but for some reason, markers are particularly bad at having packaging that doesn't match the colors of the actual marker. So to really see which brands have the most accurate colors, I'm planning to measure the hex code of each swatch against each marker using this nifty little color scanner. This should give me a clear way to determine which colors are the best match and which are way off. While that's happening, I've also been paying attention to the actual barrel designs of each of these markers. It's surprising how many brands are marketed as professional supplies, but don't even have any kind of numbering system or colors written on them. Which doesn't matter so much if you're only using a small set for coloring, but it is really frustrating if you're doing more complex art or blending with a few colors that you want to refer back to. I also noticed a lot of the cheaper alcohol markers weren't assembled fully, with the chisel not even completely in the marker. And the chisels were all facing different directions, which personally I found to be really frustrating every single time. So after all this, I haven't given each marker a specific packaging score, but I have taken note of some of these failures and any special features worth mentioning to keep in mind for my final comparison. The color accuracy test ended up being a lot more complicated than I first expected. After my team and I spent 3 days swatching, scanning, and entering every single marker result into a spreadsheet, I built myself an Excel macro that referenced the hex codes in each cell, converted it to RGB data, and then resulted in each cell magically appearing in its true color. And this is when we stumbled across the first problem. These colors didn't match. And not because the markers were bad, but because trying to scan a small marker lid without letting in any extra light ended up being harder than we expected. We tried a few other methods to scan the marker lids more accurately, but ultimately had to scrap the idea and the 3 days of data entry that we'd already done. Instead, we decided to take photos of each set of markers against the swatches, using a color calibrating chart so we could then preserve the real colors as accurately as possible. From here, Shane spent hours rescanning every color from every swatch and every marker, and we finally had more accurate numbers to work with. But this still doesn't give us full answers yet. So I did a little bit of fancy Python coding and created a program where I could import import the hex codes and spit out a calculation based on how close each hex code was to the matching marker. I used a specific color measuring formula that prioritized the hue, so this is about as accurate as we can get. I created a pass or fail system with any marker below 90% accuracy being flagged as a bad match, and I still wasn't done. I wanted to be able to translate these results into a 1 to 5 rating, so I used the minimum and the maximum results from each new percentage to balance them out from 1 to 5. Then I created a weighted score, combining both numbers with the number of bad matches making up a bigger percentage of the final score. And finally, I have results. The larger sets are going to be a more accurate score compared to the sets where I only tested 4 to 5 markers. And I wasn't able to test every single brand because we just didn't have more time. There are no brands that have perfectly matched every marker. So whatever you're using, it's always good to swatch them out before working on your project and use that as a reference instead of relying on the lids to choose your colors.
I have a swatch page. I turn to that to pick my colors, not the lids, because
Yes.
it can be hit and miss.
There is also the reality that even the swatches you've done in the past, markers aren't light fast. So those swatches actually are only good for like 12 months and then they're useless. So
Really? Wait, what if you laminate it? Mine's laminated.
Ooh.
Does that protect
Yeah,
it?
but is lamination UV sealing? I don't know. Now you're gonna have to test.
Oh, you make me nervous. If this isn't the same colors in a year's time, I'm in trouble.
Can I show you my Lightfast test? About 7 weeks ago, I finally started the coloured pencil Lightfast test that I've been promising to do. And at the same time, I decided to test some of these more popular marker brands. The purpose of a Lightfast test is to see which colours and which brands will fade quickly and which will last for many years into the future. I've had these in direct sunlight for this test, so obviously these will fade at a much faster rate than if you framed them in your house or kept them in a drawer. And that's why I've also tested them against this blue wool sample. The blue wool is specifically designed for this purpose. Each strip of colour fades at a different rate, so we can compare the fading times of the markers and the pencils to the fading times of each line. I'm not finished this test yet. I want to leave these up for a few more months to get some really accurate results. But I'm really curious to check on these now and see which brands are the first to fade. Is it weird that this is like the thing that I've been most excited about in this video, is to look at these results? But I mean, wow. It is crazy how much most of these markers have faded. The Winsor & Newton Pro marker was done a bit later, so it's a little bit hard to judge that one on the same level as the rest. Like, this black has turned like a pale green. It's also kind of interesting to see which colors have not changed at all. Like the Artex Oros brown. The aqua markers, red and orange, have faded a bit less than the other colors. The pink is completely gone. And actually the red on the Crayola Super Tips is brighter than pretty much any other red. The Crayola Kids markers are actually doing okay in these tests. The Copic haven't faded as much as some of the others. It's just like a massive, well, I mean, they're still massively faded, but the pink is at least still there. Unlike some of the others where the pink is just white now. But who do have a few surprising ones? The blue, the green, the brown and the black all kind of did okay. The Prismacolor teal kind of didn't fade that much as it just turned a little bit blue. It's interesting that like the Olo, the blue and the greens have stayed and the red and oranges have faded, but like with the Crayola, it was the other way around. So maybe we just need to like make this weird Frankenstein collection of markers that all end up being somewhat Lightfast by just taking the different ones from the different ranges that seem to survive despite everything else fading. But I do think the real winners here is the Talens Pantone markers. They are water-based, not alcohol. Pretty much none of the alcohol markers completely survived. I wonder if it's even possible to make a Lightfast alcohol marker, I'm not sure. But then also the Faber-Castell Pitt Artist, I would say they are pretty Lightfast at this point. But I'm gonna put these back on the wall and we will have another look at this in another few months in my Lightfast testing video, where I also tested all of these different pencil brands. So if you wanna see those results, make sure that you subscribe.
Lightfastness is never something I've worried about, but seeing that is very interesting. I guess because I never go into the light. I'm like my whole studio is like in you know, like there's no natural light, there's no windows. Everything's in folders. So
I do think people worry about it too much. I think like if you're creating art for fun or you're coloring, light fastness shouldn't be something to worry about. If you're selling art, then light fastness becomes really important. But then also like there are things you can do, like you can put UV sprays on them to help. And ultimately, if you're doing like marker art, you're probably better selling prints. So you just scan it when you're done.
Totally.
So this is the part in every one of these videos where I wish I had more answers and conclusive results than I do. After all, I have done every test possible and even a bunch of extra research behind the scenes to see their pricing, their color range, whether they sell refills or single markers. So here's where I'm at. I've eliminated a bunch of markers to give myself a top list in each of the categories that I think are the most useful. And since there's more data here than I could possibly show in this video, I'll be slowly adding all of these tests and the results to my website in an epic marker series, which my team and I will continue to add more over time as we gather more information. Starting with alcohol markers, I've narrowed down this huge list to my top 10. These are all great quality markers and they range from soft to firm brushes, really muted colors to really bright colors, and at all different price points. If someone tells you that one of these is their favorite, it makes sense. I've narrowed this list further by referring back to my flickability test. Choosing a winner from these is going to upset a bunch of people no matter which way I go. Have you tried the Olo yet?
I briefly have tried the Olo. I was a little bit repelled mainly because of the gimmicky feel of like, I think I'm biased against them because of Chameleon. The gimmick of the cross marker blending feels just as useless as ever and is so frustrating because you just have to wait. What's your opinion?
I wouldn't be surprised if these end up winning.
Really?
That's how good they are. They are very comparable to Copic and they are also comparable to Ohuhu. And I think that's going to come down to what people want to use the markers for. I think if you're using them more for coloring, I think that's where Ohuhu has a bit more of a... He's just disappeared.
Two things that I just wasn't wowed by. The chisel shape is quite small because I like using the sharp pointy end of the chisel for details and I like using the flat end for large areas. So I think the chisel felt a little impractical to me, but the flow doesn't feel as smooth as the Copic and Ohuhu. But I think that was just like my first impression. And again, it's all down to style, right? So because I'm very heavy-handed, so I like bashing my markers down. I like accuracy, but working fast and hard, and the ink just, these feel quality, but they don't feel suited to my work flow, my pace.
Yeah. I do think Ohuhu probably near the top when it comes to colouring style stuff. Where the Olo and the Copic I think thrive though is with realism, like cat style art. This is what I ended up creating with the Olo.
Yeah, wow. Ooh, that's amazing.
I don't know if I could do that with
I
Ohuhu.
agree with you. It's like saturation's been dialed up by 10%. And again, it all comes down to style. And again, for my personal preference, with a very comic book and cartoon style, having
want vibrance
vibrancy
straight away.
there sooner. Yeah.
Yes.
I used to sort of overuse Copics to build up to the saturation I wanted, whereas it takes me less time to get there with the Ohuhus.
I've got a lot to think about here. So before I choose a winner, let's take a look at the water-based markers and watercolor markers. I've tested all these together, but ideally I'd like to find the best markers for general drawing and coloring books and the best markers if you're leaning into the watercolor effects. For coloring books, I was looking for a marker that can handle more than a few layers, doesn't instantly ruin cheaper paper, doesn't bleed through the page, and isn't too streaky. I didn't limit it to only water-based markers, but they do make up most of this list. I've chosen my top 10 with the Bic Intensity Dual Tip just missing out because they only have a range of 12 colors despite being surprisingly good markers. The Caran d'Ache Fabralo were also close to being included, but they didn't handle as many layers as I would hope. The Corinne Brush Marker Pro and Talon's Pantone are both exceptional markers. These seem to be very high quality with beautiful colors, and the Pantone markers are some of the only light fast markers available. But when it comes to coloring books, they failed at the bleed resistance test. So these are great if you're not worried about the art on the back of your page, and they rank as some of the best performers in almost every other test. If you're wanting a good marker for coloring that's bleed resistant and water resistant, then your best choice is the Faber-Castell Pitt Artist Markers. These are unique in that they use India ink, so they're not water-based or alcohol-based, and they're light fast. And as far as I've found, they are the only India ink marker in the world. Personally, I really liked the larger markers more than the smaller brushes, and I'd love to see Faber-Castell bring out more than the current 30 colors that are already really hard to find. This feels like a massive gap in the market for what is a really cool marker. They do have other tip sizes and even fine liners, but only in black and white. And one final cool feature of these is that the marker color numbers match perfectly to other Faber-Castell products. The high quality of the Pitt Artist pens also comes with a high price, with the sets of brush tips falling between $1.50 to $3.50 per marker. All of the other markers left in my coloring final are far more affordable, ranging from 15 cents to $2 per marker. These all have around 50 to 150 colors available. They are water soluble, they blend well, and they won't bleed through the page until you build up 3 or more layers. The Crayola, Ohuhu, and Staedtler all don't offer single open stock markers, but they're also much cheaper to buy overall. The Crayola Super Tips have come out on top as the best value for money and a really good option for coloring books. Although they do have one big downside, and that's the lack of color names or numbers. So if this is an important feature for you, I'd say the Ohuhu Dual Brush pens are your best choice for affordability. These are the best value, but not quite the best overall. I found it nearly impossible to choose a winner between the Tombow Dual Brush pens and the Zig Fudebiori. I was only able to test 4 of the Zig, but these both performed the best out of every marker and seemed to be very high quality tips. Ultimately, I'm declaring Tombow the winner because they have twice the range of colors, and the option of 2 tips instead of 1 makes them just a little better overall. I've been using the Tombow for years now, and these haven't dried up or become damaged. I was hoping just a little that one of the many cheaper alternatives to these would put up a bigger fight for first place. But it's become clear now why so many people love these markers, and I'm glad I invested in the big set of 90 all that time ago. Both the Tombow and the Zig also ended up in my final 10 for the best markers for watercolor. It's become clear that markers advertised as watercolor aren't necessarily better than markers advertised as water-based. I've ended up with both in these finals. However, many of the watercolor markers do have a lot more moisture, and the colors spread more effectively when you add water. This isn't always the case, but it was a common pattern. In choosing my favorites in this category, I'm looking for a marker that works especially well with water. I want something vibrant with a big range of colors where you can easily blend the colors with water and remove any streaky lines. The real brush tips are a lot of fun with water, but they're quite different to the rest of the markers here, and maybe not the best for a beginner. There was a noticeable difference in quality in my favorite 2 real brush markers compared to the other real brush markers that I tested. They were so much more vibrant, even when a lot of water was added. Both the Corinne Real Brush Pro and the Zig Clean Color Real Brush are very good markers, very easy to blend with or without water, and can handle a lot of layers. But the price difference between these 2 is significant. The Zig also has twice as many colors available, so I've named this the best real brush watercolor marker. For the overall best in the watercolor category, I really struggled to find a winner because my final 10 were all such good markers. I eliminated Bic because they only have a few colors available, but they were surprisingly good despite not being made for watercolor. I also eliminated Molotow because the brush tips on my new set were already wearing out, so I'm not confident that they'll hold up as well as these other markers over time. The rest were very hard to separate. They all work beautifully with water, they blend well, they have vibrant colors, their packaging is clear, and their tips are high quality. But after many more tests, I was finally able to choose one marker that I am happy to declare my favorite and the winner of this category. and that's the Faber-Castell Gold Faber Aqua. It has a great range of vibrant colors, works amazing with water, has a firm but still very nice to use brush, and the bullet tip on the other end, making it great for watercolor, but also for general coloring and lettering. If you're wanting something with a ton more moisture, you might also like the Ecoline brush or the Corinne Brush Marker Pro. Or for something more affordable, both the Zig watercolor markers were a great choice. But back to our alcohol markers. We've got a good top 5, but it's time to really get into the nitty-gritty details. All are similar quality, similar experience ratings, all have big color ranges with lots of variety, and are available in sets or as individual markers. The Tombow ABT Pro comes in 5th place because it's the only marker from this final list that doesn't offer replacement nibs or refills. Because the other markers do offer refills, I've been able to calculate just how much ink is in each marker. I was surprised to find that the Copic Ciao holds nearly half the ink of the other markers. Whereas Olo have created a new innovative way to fill a marker so their small half marker holds even more ink than a Copic Sketch. Speaking of Sketch, I started this journey expecting that these would be an easy 1st or 2nd place. They are by far the most popular of the Copic range and have been one of the most popular alcohol markers for years. But it turns out they come with a huge downside. I had a bunch of Copic markers that have dried up. I noticed that my Copic Ciaos, which are like even 3 years older than my Copic Sketches, haven't dried up at all. This is my collection of Copic Sketches that have dried up, but they haven't dried up from overuse. They've dried up because the lids split.
Oh, where?
Have you ever come across that?
No. Is it a visible split?
So it takes a little bit to spot. The key to finding it, so I've noticed it is always on the chisel end, and you basically, when you pull the chisel end, it comes off a lot easier than it probably should. So that's kind of the first sign. And then on the ones that come off easier, if you look in the actual cap, it's very hard to see it. Some of them are way more obvious than others, but it's around where you see on mine the big shadow starts, right? That circle.
Yeah.
There's a tiny little split. It comes from this.
Gotcha.
So Kat pointed this out to me, and I've now gone through and I found all of these markers with split lids, and I actually don't have that big of a collection, right?
Ooh, there's a vulnerability. It's like the Death Star has that opening that it left for attack.
And the catch with these is that I can't now refill them because the marker case is busted. This has happened to 12% of my markers. And I'm finding stories from other people who use markers more often and have an even higher fail rate. Now, Copic knows this is an issue. They've even included it in their FAQ, suggesting to replace the caps if they split, but they don't sell replacement caps. I can't believe it's come to this, but this feels like a total deal breaker for the Copic Sketch, and I can't possibly choose them as a winner with this kind of issue. And I'm not sure if the Copic Ciao can quite beat some of these other markers now available. Both the Copic Classic and the Touch markers are great, especially if you're looking for an established brand or a high quality marker. The Copic are especially good for realism, and if you're looking for more of a muted overall palette. I don't have many of the Touch to really compare the colors in detail. They are priced similar to the Copic Classic, but they have been amazing to try. So for me, this competition really comes down to the Ohuhu and the Olo. Even before this point, preference plays a big part. The Ohuhu seem to have more vibrant colors, but that's not necessarily what you might be looking for, especially if you're trying some of the techniques that Kat showed us in my last video. Olo is a really impressive marker, but buying them in halves, is it a feature or a gimmick? I see a lot of positives to this system. It takes up less space. You'll always have good blends ready to go, and you only buy the tips that you need. The downside is that you will need to pay double if you want a chisel and a brush tip in the same color, and there's not really a convenient way to store these that allows you to see the colors all at once if you do it the other way. But they are a nice marker and absolutely a new personal favorite. The Ohuhu is a much more affordable marker. Somehow they've figured out how to make a really good marker, but at a much lower price than all of the other really good markers. They are the reason why these other cheap knockoffs get any sales at all. If Ohuhu is so good, surely there are other good cheap markers, right? Well, maybe not. The Ohuhu tip is amazing. It's a little more firm than the Olo and the Copic and a little more moist. So it can be a little bit harder to blend, but the vibrant colors make it the perfect choice for coloring or comic book art. And with everything taken into consideration, Ohuhu is today's winner. I can't believe you've made it this far, and since we've already crammed so much into this video, we saved a few extra thoughts and a look behind the scenes for our new YouTube member after show. Are we talking about why we never really got to the acrylic markers or the permanent markers or the fine liner markers? And I'll be going super in depth on the real touch marker conspiracy that's spiraled out of control. It's available to watch now for my members, which you can find more about at the link below. Did I accomplish everything I'd hoped in this video? Actually, no. I wish I could have compared all the fine liners and all the paint markers and even added more markers to my current list, but there is always more. And this video's script has already been over 12,000 words. So I think it's a great time to finish here, and I hope it's been interesting and useful. I will be sharing all my testing and detailed results on my website when I finally have a time to gather it all into one place. But for now, the only thing left to do
Is pack up.